Hello and welcome to my latest video. In this video I'm going to be painting another Ork special character, and this time it's Morrow White. Games Workshop sent me this as a preview copy and I've only just got around to painting it, but I do think it's a really cool model. I like the shark squig thing quite a lot, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on in this video. There you can see the picture of him for how the Games Workshop Heavy Metal Studio painted him, but mine's not going to look anything like that. So to start with, I'm actually going to do some airbrushing. Now I don't usually use an airbrush for work, but because I want this to be a slightly quicker model, the airbrush, I'm just going to use it just to speed up the first process a little bit, just to get some colour and some light volumes on there. So if you don't have an airbrush, you don't need one. It's not going to make a massive difference to the model. It just kind of speeds it all up a little bit. So here you can see, to start with, I'm just doing the painting the tongue for the shark squig. I know they have a proper name and I can't remember what it is, so it's just going to be a shark squig. And so all I'm using is just pink horror mixed in with some Vallejo airbrush thinner, around about 30 psi, and through a size 0.4 airbrush needle. You can see that I just airbrushed the tongue, and then also airbrush inside the mouth. This will speed up the painting of the inside of the mouth quite a lot, actually, because it's one of the harder things to paint. Having to get your paintbrush in there, you won't get a very nice clean lay. You have to do lots and lots of layers, whereas with the airbrush you can very quickly just spray inside it and get it all done. You can see a couple of gaps right at the back of the mouth there. The tongue covers those. On the roof of the mouth, I have actually filled in the gap, so nothing to worry too much about there. I'm also using the airbrush just to paint in some pink gums for it. I thought this would be a bit more interesting, add a little bit of colour to the outside, because I am keeping the outside of the shark squig very dark and desaturated, and quite simple colour wise really, and this will just add a little pop of colour to it. Now I'm also going to do a few light volumes onto the for highlights, basic highlights onto the squig thing. And as you saw, it's basalt grey again, thinned down with Vallejo airbrush thinner, with around about 30 psi and a 0.4 millimeter needle. And you can see here, so the reason that I'm using basalt grey, so it's still a fairly dark grey, but it's obviously lighter than the black. But once you go a little bit lighter than that, anything that's has a lot of white in it, it doesn't airbrush quite as easily. You either have to thin it a little bit more, just take your time, because it's very easy to get the spatter because of the larger pigment particles and things, or you can just use something that's more like, say, a Tamiya paint. Those airbrush very well, but because I'm just sticking with kind of like Vallejo and Games Workshop paints mostly for painting this, then a darker grey will get the job done. And because I'm going to be painting highlights up on top of it anyway, there's no real need to take the highlights any brighter, so it's just very subtle highlight placement. And again, just usual trick, hold the model under a lamp just to see how the light hits it, and that'll give you some a good indication, because in some of the creases and crevices and all those sort of areas you will get highlight placement. It's not just a case of picking out the highest raised areas on the model. You can see things like on the creases on the cheek, you'll see in those recesses there, those will be highlights and things like that. Which is all very important for getting the character of the model later on. Here you can see I'm using some Evil Sunz Scarlet just around the engine that's strapped onto his side, and also there's a little, he has a robot leg, so there's a few little scars and things around it. So I'm just doing some very, very simple, red airbrush spraying on there. Don't worry if you go a little bit over the top with it. It will look quite red at the moment, but when we start painting on the details on the shark part, we'll be painting over it and it'll dull it right down. But the nice thing is, it just gives it a little bit more kind of interest on the model, because there is so much kind of black and grey on there with all the whole of the shark squig is very desaturated, then just having a few little spot colours like this just makes it a bit more interesting. Next up, I'm just going to go back and paint areas black that have had overspray, because I'm pretty lazy when I airbrush, so I haven't bothered to mask anything off. And really it's quicker and easier to just paint over the areas where you've got a bit of overspray. Well, in this case anyway. Just quicker to go over it with some model colour black than it is to actually spend the time masking off these areas. I mean, you don't actually have to mask off the area, to repaint this area black if you don't want to, but it does make things a little bit easier later on, especially for the teeth. But because the engine area is going to be painted like in a non-metallic metal, kind of rusty steel sort of colour, then having a bit of red on there wouldn't make a massive amount of difference to it. The teeth, on the other hand, they do need to be black, because there's going to be part of a high contrast look that will make the teeth shine a lot, so they need that darker base colour. So there was a little cut there in between, and what I did was I gave the model a coat of ultramatte varnish. And the reason I did that is because I don't like the strong shine that you get. It's not strong, it's kind of like a satin shine. It just kind of distracts me a little bit from where I want to start placing on highlights, because the shine on the model kind of, it gives a bright spot, and you can't always tell when you put the highlight there. Sometimes it kind of camouflages it a little bit. So having like a matte area to paint on just means that I can focus purely on what I'm actually painting, rather than the shine and glare that you get on the model when you look at it. If you look on the top left there, you can see I've got the wet palette with various greys placed on there. Now, you don't have, I'll tell you the colours that I'm using, but you don't have to use these specific colours. You can just mix your own versions of grey if you want. So you already know that there's Basalt grey was sprayed on there. And what you'll actually find as well is, because I didn't do a very opaque highlight with the airbrush with it, that if you just use Basalt grey over the top, which is what I'm using here, it actually looks very light in comparison to what's already there. And it's just because the marks that I'm making are much more opaque. It's still the same colour, but as you can see, it stands out a lot more. The other colours, so I've got dark sea grey, and so dark sea grey is they're slightly, I guess, so it's in the top left there. It's a little bit of a warmer kind of grey, and we've also got neutral grey, that's the bottom middle. Then there's also black, which is in the top right, and then in the top middle, that's a mixture of black and basalt grey. It's looking quite dark on there. You could probably get away with using German grey, but again, you don't actually need any of these particular greys. If you just got black and white and mix your own versions, then you can do the same thing. It doesn't. So I mentioned that the dark sea grey is a little bit more warm. It doesn't matter. These slight hints of colour into the greys, they make such a small difference. You won't really be able to pick them out too much unless you go and make a very, very opaque large area with them. But because they're all mixed together anyway, and I will be going up to pale grey blue as well, so that will cancel out the warmth of the grey anyway. It's just because it saves me having to mix a lot of colours together. So I just can take the paint straight from the pot. But if you, as I said, don't have any of these specific colours, then just mix them all together. Get lots of variations of grey. You can have as many variations as you want. The more variations, the easier it is to do the layers and the blending, because you'll have steps up to those different different colours of grey. You can see here the marks I'm making. They look a little bit messy. That's fine. I want a textured effect on there. Just be aware. I think it's pretty obvious, but so you can see how strong the marks stand out. And again, this is just from using the basalt grey on top of the basalt grey. And again, the reason it looks lighter is because it's more concentrated. So when you put the airbrush spray on it, it gives a very fine, translucent layer. And you can see a little bit as well some of the speckling. Now remember, I say you can see it, it's very, very fine, and you can see it only because it's zoomed in on the video. When you actually hold it in your hand, it looks pretty smooth. But the textures that I'm putting on, they're they're going to need to be placed all over the model. Now I'm going to show you how to do it just on the face area, because otherwise it's going to take a long time. It'll be a pretty boring video of just me doing the same thing over and over on there, and I just finish off the rest of it until we get to the next video, where I'll finish off doing all the shark area, because it's all going to, once you've seen enough of this, you get the general idea. The main things that I want you to pay attention to are the shape of the marks, and especially a little bit later on, if you see the kind of neck area, but it's going to be on top of the head as well. It's not all these squiggly texture marks, so there are a lot of squiggly texture marks, and they help to give the impression that they sort of blend into the scratches. So if you see on the sculpt, before I ever even painted anything, there are scratches all over the nose and on the head and things. And then adding all these little scribbly texture marks on top, they kind of blend in and make it look like the squigs had a lot of battle, and there's a lot of damage to it. And so looking at the marks, you can see there's the scratchy marks, but then there are also some longer marks. Now there's one near the nose, it's a big long curve that goes into the recess, and I already mentioned, pay attention. When the light hits the model, it sometimes hits inside the recesses and makes them a highlight. Now this is a naturally occurring effect, and it just makes things look more realistic. If you only ever paint raised areas as highlights, it can look good, but it won't look natural. Light travels in a straight line, and if the crevice lines up with the light source, then it still reflects the light, regardless of it being in a recess or not. But just to carry on about the marks I'm making, so there's going to be some of these long marks, and especially as the video progresses, and sometimes a couple of time skips or whatever, as I'm just doing more of the marks, you'll see various marks on top of the head, around on the neck, some on the nose a bit as well, and they're going to be quite long parallel lines. And it's really important, these, because one, they fill in the area much quicker, because if you're doing all these sort of squiggly lines, there's kind of squiggly, sketchy, rough marks everywhere. They're quicker, and they're easier than doing perfect blending, but it still takes a long time. It's a fairly large model, this shark thing, so just to cover the whole surface area in these squiggles, it takes a while. But if you can, fitting in these other slightly slower to make, but they're much larger, so they take less time to do, and they're easier as well. You don't have to think very much about the placement, as long as they follow the shape of the model, and that's the important thing. Get a lot of the lines to just follow the shape. Now the nice thing is that the sculpting has got creases and things already on it. So you're just adding to it and emphasizing it and adding more details. So you put these little lines in, and as I said, you'll see them appear on the model. And once you've got those in, and then you fill in the rest of the area with the squiggles and things, and then the squiggles get more dense on the highlighted areas, and it works. They work as highlights, and so you layer on top of them, just using the tip of the brush. It just makes it quite simple to do. There's not a lot of worrying about being very, very precise about any of these marks, and it's only when you get to the final highlights where you just have to take your time a bit more. But just to really hammer home the thing about following the shape, you see, so you've got the eye, you've got the little around the eye socket, the bony areas, you're following the shape there. Then there's this little kind of indentation to the right hand side of the eye, and then I've got these creases coming out of it. Now those aren't sculpted on, I've just painted them on, but they still follow, they follow the shape round. And the nice thing is, you can paint pretty much whatever sort of marks you want. If you can just get them to follow the shape on the model, they'll look natural. So don't worry too much about having to copy exactly what I've painted here. You should be able to take this technique and just use it on any model you want. And the same, it's easy. It's a much easier technique to do on organic surfaces, because organic things tend to look a bit more random in nature. But Even for something like a Space Marine, Space Marine armor, if you get into the habit of trying to make the marks follow the curvature of the armor and things, it'll just make them look a bit more natural, and they will work with the model. So you can do a very sort of scratchy, very worn look to Space Marine armor. So he's been really into the wars, and I'm probably actually going to do a video on using the same technique on a Space Marine, so you can see how it would translate. But it's really just a case of following the shape of whatever surface it is you're painting. You can add a bit of randomness in there. You just add like marks that sometimes go against the grain, or cross over and things. That's part of the wear and tear element of it, and they look like random scratches. But if you get a lot of the marks that follow the shape of, as I mentioned, organic surfaces, it's easier to follow. There tends to be a lot more movement in the shape, so you can see like on the head and like on the neck and things, there's all these different curves and lines, so it's easy to fit in more, and they blend in more with the model. But it helps to give shape to the model. So here I've actually gone up to dark sea grey now. I mentioned I'm going to take the highlights a little bit higher, but I just want to start off at this stage getting the highlights raised a little bit higher. So that's why I've only got these onto the wet palette at the moment, because it looks just a little bit lighter than neutral grey on the wet palette, but when you get it onto the model, you can see that it's already quite a bit brighter. Now, ideally, before you start putting in these highlights, you'd cover most of the model in the texture texture effect, but it's going to take me a while to get all that done, and I just wanted to show you the process, and then you can again finish the rest of the model off as you see fit. Here it's a little bit out of focus, but you can see some of those lines I was talking about, these long kind of parallel lines. Now, they don't have to be perfectly parallel. In fact, it actually looks a bit better if they're not completely parallel, because then it starts to look more unnatural, like having a little bit of variation. Sometimes they touch each other, you get too close and they overlap, things like that, but roughly parallel, all going in the same direction. But bearing in mind that sometimes like details sculpted onto the model don't go over those, so you can see on the temple, the head area there, just to the top right of the eye, there's like a little cross in there, so that's a scar that's sculpted on. Don't go over the top of things like that. Paint the edges of that, so then you can still keep the detail that's sculpted in there. There is one other little trick. So you might find when you're painting on the highlights that, and you won't see me do this in the video because I didn't feel that it needed it, but if you find that you've painted on your highlights and they're too bright, and by that I mean that it's too big a jump between the base colour, even after you've put the Basalt Grey airbrush highlight on there. So you've got your highlight, you're ready to start painting your textures on. When you start painting the textures, maybe you've picked a colour that's a little bit too bright. So maybe you didn't pick Basalt Grey as your first colour for painting on the texture detail, or you've started painting it on in an area that you didn't put any highlights on, so more towards the top centre of the head, or like under the underside of the belly, areas like that are pretty dark still. You still have your airbrush, obviously, so just go back and put the Basalt Grey back in the airbrush, thin it down, and then you can blend in, make sure it's thin quite a lot, but you can blend over the top of the marks that you put on, and it'll soften them in. Also, not just the Basalt Grey, if you go back with so I'll probably recommend using the German grey, but you could also mix your own Basalt Grey mixed with a bit of black, just to kind of get a bit of a soft transition at the edges. That'll soften any of the texture marks that you've put on there. Now, so it's something you can do. You have to be a little bit careful with the airbrush, because obviously if you do too much, you're going to completely cover the texture you painted on. It's going to vanish. But another thing you can do, if you're not confident with the airbrush and you don't want to risk doing that, so you're painting the texture on, it stands out a little bit too much, but you feel like if you use the airbrush, you're going to just wipe out what you've got there. Then you can just glaze it instead. Now you glaze with the airbrush. That's what you would do. What I was describing there with the very thin down layers where you can just blend it in. But again, if you don't feel confident to do that, then just use a well palette. Add some of the colour, a bit of water, turn it into a glaze. Around about 4 or 5 parts water to 1 part paint. A fairly large brush, like size 1 or 2, and then load up the brush, rub it on a kitchen towel, so that there's not too much left loaded in the brush, and just gently glaze the midtones and the shadows. Just softening over the texture. It might take a couple of layers, but it will tone them down quite a bit. And they'll actually look a bit more detailed and just nicer just by glazing over them a bit. So don't worry. And I mean, this is something that I'm actually going to do. It's probably going to be more in the second video. I do it a little bit at the end of this one as well, but it's just it will just neaten everything up, and it also allows you to add a few more colours later on as well. So never worry too much about over highlighting an area as long as you've painted it correctly, so it looks nice and neat and bright and shiny. If it's too bright, it doesn't matter, because you can just glaze it down and that will actually make it look better. So here you can see I'm just going over the top of these highlights that I've already painted on there, and I think you can more clearly see now a lot of the texture lines that I was talking about. These long parallel lines, they follow the shape of the model. Again, very easy to do. Make sure you kind of use the tip of the brush. The problem will be if you push slightly harder on the brush, it'll make the line get fatter. Now, to a certain extent, some of that is good because you cover more area, but it'll make the line go thicker as you go down. In some areas you want that, other areas you don't. That's more of a case of brush control. So if you want it, then clearly paint it on like that. But just be a little bit careful and mindful not to push too hard on the paintbrush if you want to keep the line fairly consistent as you go around. And that's also something to bear in mind with different paintbrushes, different paintbrush suppliers. In this case, I'm using a size 00 Artis Opus. I like the shape and size of this brush. It doesn't get too fat into the belly of the brush, so it allows me. I can push a little bit harder, and it means the line that I make isn't going to get very fat. If you go up to like a size 1 or 2, clearly those are much fatter brushes, and so if you push harder on that, like the benefit of those is you have a bigger belly on the brush, which means it holds more paint, so you can keep painting for longer before refilling it. The negative is if you push a little bit harder, then you get a very fat mark. So what you'll actually find is a slightly thinner brush. If you want to do lots of long marks quickly and not worrying about the pressure too much, you actually do them a little bit better with the thinner brush than you do with a larger brush. So here you can see I've made quite a bit of progress on getting some texture marks all over the face. They they stand out. Some of the brightnesses are a little bit high, but also remember it's under a bright lamp at the moment. When you tend to look at this in the flesh, it doesn't look anywhere near as high contrast with the lines individually. They look quite well blended in. Obviously zoomed in as well, but so now I'm just going to focus a little bit on the gum area. So you can see some more colours appeared on to the wet palette. One of them you haven't seen too much of was the pale grey blue. That's purely for highlighting the greys, but the other colours are again, so we use the pink horror colour when we airbrushed the gums on, and you can see in the bottom right hand corner that's pure pink horror. Then next to that in the middle bottom, that's got a bit of white to it, and then on the bottom left there's a lot more white added to it. I think it's fairly straightforward what I'm doing there, but what you're going to find is when you take the pure pink horror and you apply it to the model on top of the pink gums that you've already airbrushed on, it's going to look more saturated. Again, when I airbrush the model on, it's not a completely opaque layer. Take your time and do it like a nice airbrush effect and just blend it in. And there's definitely going to be certain elements of that airbrush layer, especially towards the edges, where it fades into the black, where clearly some of the black is showing through. So it's not a strong opaque color. When you apply the pure pink horror, you're getting a much more opaque mark, and it will look more saturated. So you can use that as a highlight straight over the top of the pink horror that's already there. And this is painted actually very similar to how the skin's painted. You can see I'm just very quickly slapping on these marks and taking them a little bit brighter and higher. I am going to add a bit more saturation later on by adding red on top of it, but I'll talk about that when we get to it. Because they do look quite pink at the moment when I'm applying these on, so look for how the light hits the model. Pick out raised bumps, pick out even recesses where they're still in line with the light source. So if you look on the gums near the front, just underneath the nostril, you see it goes right up underneath that kind of like grey blob. So you've got these pink highlights right going up into the crease. There's also some little cuts and things in the gums. Pick those out as well. It's sort of like rough stippling, scratchy marks, things like that. And again, remember this is zoomed in, so this looks more messy than it really is. And you can see as well that I just jump back and forwards a few times, so I can work on the skin effect a bit more. Now you can make the skin effect as polished as you want, really. So you've got like the base work there done. If you wanted, to do it up to a Golden Demon standard, that it's perfectly easy to do. I mean, I say easy, like it's perfectly straightforward to do from this standard. So even though it looks a little bit sketchy, it's just a case of taking your time, putting neater marks on top, just making sure everything blends together nicely. And then, of course, there'll be some glazing later on, and that'll soften all the marks and just make things look a bit neater. It's also a case when you're highlighting up, as you go through the different stages of grey, that you start looking for the marks that you've already made on there, and then turn some of those into three-dimensional looking shapes on the skin. So look for bit like, so if there could be a line with a dark patch, then pick out the lower edge, then it will make it look three-dimensional. So it looks like you have different layers of or different depths of scars. Clearly the ones that are sculpted on, those look the deepest. You still pick out the lower edges of those, that makes them look three-dimensional, but the other marks that you paint on, you still turn those into three-dimensional shapes with the lower edge highlight, and then it all kind of works together, and it just looks like there's more scars on it, and some of them just aren't as deep as the ones that are sculpted on. It's just a very quick process as well. It's not a case of you don't have to pick out every single mark. Sometimes, like, there could be really, really shallow marks on the model, and you don't need to pick out those too much at all. And it's just really a case of how much time do you want to spend on it. And of course, with using the lighter colours, it's always going to be the case, and I've mentioned this quite a few times in other videos as well. When you first apply the paint, it looks really bright. It stands out too strongly almost. As it dries, it gets duller. It's just something that you have to be aware of. It's a bit annoying, really, because you think, oh, you've painted that, it's quite bright, job's done, and then it dries, and you think, oh, I've got to go back and do multiple layers and sometimes take it even brighter. But that is also one of the reasons why you have to be a bit careful by, if you just go straight up to white as a highlight, and you add a lot of it, then that's it, you just can't go any higher. Which means that you're not going to be able to do bright, high contrast areas on the model that stand out as much. So at this stage, ideally, you would have covered pretty much the whole of the shark body with the texture mark. I've obviously got to spend a bit more time blending it all in and making it look good, but I think you get a good idea of how it all looks at the moment. And now we're going to move on to the teeth. Now the teeth are super quick and simple. A few people asked me if I painted them as non-metallic gold. I didn't intend to. The issue is that I wanted them to be really high contrast, so they stand out a lot, and I've painted them a little bit maybe too bone coloured. So it might be the case if you don't want them to be as yellowy as these turn out to be. But I think they look cool anyway, so whatever. But so to start off with, it's XV88, and the most important part for painting these teeth is that you're looking for a primary light source. Now, quite often, if you see maybe how Games Workshop paint teeth, they will paint them all in the same way. So one tooth might be painted so that the brightest point is at the bottom of the tooth, then they're all painted like that. Then when you get to the bottom layer, then it's the same thing. Like the tip of the tooth is the brightest part, and it gets darker towards the gums. The problem is that that's not how light works. So in terms of realism, that's incorrect. However, it still looks good. You get that high contrast thing, and it still stands out nicely. But for this style of painting, what I'm trying to do is have a more realistic kind of lighting. And what happens is the teeth on the top row, the brightest point is at the top of the curve, which is right next to the gums, and you actually leave the tip of the tooth quite dark. And then on the bottom row of teeth, it's the opposite. So the tips are the brightest part, and it gets darkest near the gums. It's just something to be aware of, something to look for. So certain, it's not like one is right and one is wrong. It just depends on the look that you're going for. And if you want to get kind of light volumes onto your model so it looks realistic with a light source, then you do have to pay more attention to how the light hits each individual part of the model. You can't just take, say, so even on the top row of teeth, one tooth might be brighter than another one. You can't just paint them all the same to get the result. You have to really pay attention, decide which one you want to be the brightest part, spend time on that standing out, and then other teeth might be toned down a little bit. The other colours for the teeth after the XV88 is I've got Balor Brown, Morghast Bone, Screaming Skull, and then I've got P3 Morrow White, but any white will do. It's just a case of layering it up now. Again, I'm painting on textures and details that aren't sculpted onto the teeth, but there are enough details sculpted onto the teeth so it all blends in. I think it's probably easy to see on the bottom row of teeth at the moment, but there are little chips and deformities and scratches all over them. So if you just what I'm doing is, so this saves me time, so I don't have to do lots of blending again on the teeth. You see at the bottom edges where I'm keeping it darker, just paint some lines that again they follow the shape of the tooth. There's all kind of like weird angles on the teeth as well, so you don't have to have it perfect, but you've got these sort of vertical lines. They kind of follow some of the facets, as because the teeth are all quite lumpy really. And then you just paint it. If it's a flat surface and you don't want to get it completely kind of brown or bony coloured, then just paint a couple of lines on it, following the shape of the tooth, and it fills the area quite nicely. So the primary light source highlight, obviously again at the top of the teeth, you go over that a few times. You want to paint from the top towards the brightest part and from the bottom up towards the brightest part. That'll help you create a slight transition. You want the paint fairly watered down, around about 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint. You could probably get away with 50-50. It really depends exactly on your own paint and the paint mixtures, because sometimes the pots dry out, things like that. But as long as the paint flows quite nicely, you won't have too many problems. And you're just layering up on top of each layer. It should be a fairly translucent layer, because if you've got the paint to the right sort of consistency, then you will see some of the paint underneath showing through, so you probably need 1 or 2 layers each time you do a highlight. But every time you add to that layer, you want to make the area smaller. So the opacity, the more opaque the area, the smaller it becomes right in the middle of the the highlight point. And then in the darker areas where you've painted in a few lines, just put a couple of dots. You can either do white or Screaming Skull or a combination of the two. You can see there, just picked out a few of the lines and things. It makes it very sort of high contrast at this stage. It will need a little bit of glazing on top of it. You can see I've actually just done some there as well. I will go back to that in a moment. But just to talk about some of the other glazing. So I'm using Khorne Red. And there's already some of that on as well. I've just kind of painted it into the gums, and you can also get a little bit on the teeth. It's just really nice. The red will pop out quite strongly. So I've almost turned this into a glaze. Well, it is a glaze basically. It's a heavy glaze. It's around about 2 parts water to 1 part paint, maybe 3 parts. Just be careful. You want it to be a fairly translucent layer anyway. And you're just painting it into the shadows, recesses, anywhere that's not a highlight. Also, I end up painting mine around the eyeball. So you see I've got some red in there. I do go back and add a few more. And you can see at the bottom of the teeth what I was talking about. The brightest points are now the tips of the lower layer. And the brightest points are the top near the gum of the upper layer. Now, so quickly just moving on to how to paint the eyeball. It looks quite impressive, or quite eye-catching, to excuse the pun, but it is actually fairly simple to do. I paint the eyeball pale grey blue, no, actually, scratch that. I paint the eyeball dark sea grey. It doesn't actually matter too much, but, it's just to get some white of the eye in there. This is a more important stage, so you're just going to paint the kind of a big black circle on there. Now, it is kind of important that you make it fairly round. Remember, this is zoomed in, so it looks a little bit blobby. I haven't got it perfect. I'm not that concerned. It's a fairly quick model, but get it roughly circular, but make it as big as you can while still seeing some of the white of the eye. The bigger you can make this black circle, the easier the next stage is going to be. It might be the case that you don't have the steadiest hand or whatever, and I do recommend, for doing painting like this, you do need to support your wrists. So it doesn't matter how you do it. Like, lots of different painters use different methods. For me, I rest my wrists against the desk, so it's only my hands that are loose. My arms aren't floating around anywhere. So rest your wrists on the table. Just be careful with your breathing. Just be gentle. Don't be chewing gum or anything like that. Just try and keep your body as still as possible. It'll just, it'll aid with the fine detail movements. I also don't recommend you be drinking coffee and things if you're going to do some very fine detail painting. It could raise your heartbeat, and actually, oddly, your heart rate, if it goes a little bit high or you get a bit excited, it can affect your movements slightly for the fine detail work. If you get the black area, you get a little bit wrong. You get some edges that stick out, whatever. Just go back with the grey. You can just sharpen it up at the edge. Cut into the black outline and make it neat. Or indeed, if you go completely wrong, just completely go over it again with the grey colour, and try again. This is the hardest part, though, painting in the green iris. I'm using Warboss green. What you do is, so you're going to paint a circle on top, which will leave a black circle in the middle, which will then become the pupil, and there's a very fine black outline still left. So it's not just a case of the green is touching the grey white of the eye. It will help the green area to stand out a bit. But when you're painting the green circle on top of the black, you can go all the way around, but you really want to start at the top and then stop at the bottom. do it for the left hand side and then on to the right hand side. And what that'll do is, again, you'll have a build-up of paint at the bottom, so you get like a more opaque layer. I've then gone to Moot Green. I'm doing the same thing over the top, but I'm only starting from about a third of the way up, going from, you know, starting high and then finishing at the bottom, then go to the other side, starting about a third of the way up, then dragging the paintbrush downwards, stopping at the bottom. This results in a more opaque finish at the bottom, which makes it brighter, because the Moot Green is brighter than the Warboss Green and the black underneath it. So you get this really strong transition going around. Now it's just a case of painting a little white highlight dot. I say white, so I'm using pale grey blue. And so you can, if you want, just put a dot on there. That will work fine. But I wanted to do it, you know, slightly more like a longer light. The shape of the highlight, it does depend pretty much on the light source. So if you're using a spotlight, say, you know, you have a shiny ball and you have a spotlight over it, it's definitely going to be a dot on there. If you have like a long rectangular lamp, then the shape will be sort of a long highlight on there, but it does conform to the shape of the object the light is on as well. So you want it to curve around a little bit, things like that. And you can see here, you know, I've painted sort of a dodgy kind of blobby stretched out shape on it, and then I'll do a final white dot right in the center of that. The reason I'm using a grey and then a white, it just helps add a bit of a transition to it. So, you know, at the edges it's a little bit softer, whereas if you go in straight with a pure white dot, it can look a bit harsh, not as it just doesn't look as good. And then here I'm just putting a little bit of white at the bottom onto the white of the eye as well, makes it look a little bit shiny. You don't have to do this a little bit if you don't want to. It doesn't make a huge impact, but it, you know, it just makes the eye stand out a bit more. But if you're worried that you're going to catch some of the eye that you've already painted, it's better to not do that. And there you go, there's the eye painted. It's pretty simple. I say simple clearly, like if it's, you know, for the fine detail, fine motor movements of your hands and things, then it's not that easy, but it's straightforward. So the process is very easy to understand, see how it works. Of course, you have to practice to get the motor control to do that. So I ended up not showing you about the glazes. It was a bit annoying. I didn't have them recorded on the video, but I think you can see anywhere. So anyway, so I used some Mournfang brown and just glazed onto the teeth anywhere that wasn't like a bright highlight. So, you know, into the shadows. It just knocks back a little bit some of the bright, or rather the darker areas. Which would be around about 4 parts water to 1 part paint, something like that anyway. But also then I use some of that same glazing on the skin of the shark. I am going to do, in the next video, I will cover some of that, because there's a lot of area on the shark and you will want to get some glazes on there just to make it look a little bit neater. But anyway, that's the end of this video. I hope you found it interesting. There's going to be maybe 1 or 2 more videos on the shark. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.